Thank you to Fred Davey, who I don't think is present, but inspired this project. And thank you to all the American heroes, past, present, and future, who have inspired and created the context for this project. I want to offer a set of quotes to kind of frame our work. One is by John Lewis, the great John Lewis, from whose language and whose spirit we take the line, "The vote is sacred." So here's what John Lewis said about this: "The right to vote is precious, almost sacred. It is the most powerful nonviolent tool or instrument in the democratic society. We must use it. And we must allow other people to use it. We must create the context and the sense of comfort and the protectiveness where other people feel the ability, the right, the kind of spirit to vote." And that's what this project is about. I think of this as kind of at the intersection of two beautiful lines by Martin Luther King Jr. One is the very famous line that the arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. That's kind of the sense of like we're on the right side, and there are things in the universe that are conspiring to be with us, and it might take a while, but we're there. And the second line is, the pendulum doesn't swing on its own. You have to swing it. You have to push it. And that's what we're doing, right? I think there's this sense of there are forces in the universe that are whispering in our ear. What you're doing is the right thing to do and is the important thing to do. But there's also a sense of like, it's not going to happen just on its own. You have to push the pendulum. You have to write the next chapter. You have to use your arms and legs and mouths to help people, to help create the context for this. So I love that we kind of live at the intersection of that. The last thing I want to say is on the particular role of religious communities, and this was the original conversation with Chris many years ago when we started this work. Listen, right now in Florida, it is largely diverse communities of faith that in civil society that are partnering together to make sure that people have places to stay and food to eat, and that they are as dry as they can be, and that their homes will be rebuilt, and that they have a sense of comfort, and that their pets will live in the state of Florida as that hurricane hit. And my dad is in Florida. My dad is on the East Coast where a number of tornadoes touched down. My uncle and my cousins are in Tampa, where the eye of the hurricane almost crossed over. Virtually all of us have some family in Florida, and we have a deep sense of the role that diverse communities of faith are playing to help and protect that area. That is sacred work, and this is sacred work. This is a different kind of way that diverse faith communities, and we describe that at Interfaith America as everything from atheist to Zoroastrian, right? It's your orientation around faith. Diverse faith communities make people feel comfortable and protected after a natural disaster. That is sacred work. Diverse faith communities cooperating together. It recognize that voting is sacred and help create a context that facilitates people's votes. That's what we're doing today, and I'm really proud that we're doing it together.
Well, I want to start by saying thank you. Thank you for those words, Eboo. Thank you for serving on the National Task Force on Election Crises, which I helped to staff. And also just a word of thanks for the Interfaith America team for partnering on the Faith and Elections Playbook. When we were looking for a faith-based partner, faith-inspired partner to work with to help equip faith communities with ways that they can take action to support the 2024 election, it was pretty clear that Interfaith America would be the ideal partner from a branding standpoint and from the work that you do every day. But there was a version of that project that could have just been, okay, we have good expertise and a good brand. Let's get this website. It looks nice. Let's move on to other things. But what's been beautiful is the incredible work that Interfaith America has done in partnership with Protect Democracy to not make this just a web page, but a movement. And we have weekly calls. We do this work together, and we've been able to engage thousands of communities of faith across the country, people of faith across the country. So just want to start by thanking you all for the work that you're doing and the way that you do the work. I think that's the only appropriate way that I could start this before we get into the scary things about the election. So I'll quickly just go through what is the National Task Force on Election Crises, and then I'll just walk you through the stages of the election, how it works, the potential disruptions, and then the most important thing, which is what each of us can do in response to the potential pain points in the election process. As I mentioned, EBOO is one of the members of the National Task Force on Election Crises. It's a group of 50 people, give or take, with expertise in a wide variety of areas. And this group comes together to really focus on preventing, preparing for, and mitigating potential crises in our election. And it's people who have served as cabinet officials in both parties, people who have run elections in red states and blue states, and then also an understanding that elections don't just happen in the specific election sphere. They're community efforts, and they exist within the context of what's going on in the economy, in healthcare. Is there a pandemic happening, for example? So this is a group of people who really their main focus is to lend that expertise, bring it together to focus on free and fair elections and the peaceful transfer of power. And I'm happy I'm not prestigious enough to be a member of the group. I just staff the group and share their information with the world. And the way that we mostly do that is through deep research and analysis on different topics, and then also rapid response. If there's an issue that comes up that needs an immediate nonpartisan response from experts, we can move relatively quickly to get something out. And then also through our Task Force Advocates network that many of you are signed up. It's a network of about 6,000 community leaders across the country who we resource with information that they can then take to their communities. So what we're going to spend most of our time on today is focusing on the stages of the election and the potential disruptions and what we can do in this environment. I want to note on the front end that there are key messages and a way of speaking about our elections that you'll hear repeated throughout these different stages. So I also wanted to pull this out at the beginning, some of the key messaging, promoting peace and calm and patience with the process, calling for every eligible voter to be able to cast their vote and for every vote to be counted. And then we should each try to provide nonpartisan, accurate information to our networks and set expectations about potential challenges and delays in the electoral process. And what we'll do is go through each of these different sections. This is our sort of one page of the election process, sort of a roadmap that goes from the conventions through to the inauguration. We're going to zoom in on each of these sections. And I should also mention that we're going to share these slides with you. This is a lot of information. And so the idea here is that we give you an introduction and you can go deeper, figure out what's most relevant to you, because you're not going to remember everything I say today, but you'll remember, oh, he said something about that. Hopefully you'll remember that. And so the first thing that we'll zoom in on here is the pre-election process. And you'll notice as we go through, some of these processes overlap with each other. And also the pre-election process, we're starting to get to the tail end of it. What's important about this, though, is that when we think about potential efforts to subvert the election or think about potential challenges that could arise later in the process, each of these phases matter, and each of us needs to do our part to try to promote confidence in the election and trust in the election at each stage of the process. So this pre-election period is really when all the things are done to ensure that our election can run smoothly, hiring staff, finalizing the voter rolls, making sure the voter rolls are up to date, designing and printing the ballots, getting voting locations, 20% of which are houses of worship, and testing the voting machines, which there's a lot of misinformation about voting machines. It's important to know that voting machines have to be, and tabulation machines have to be, they go through a bidding process, a certification process, and then they're tested publicly. We actually, as part of the Faith and Elections Playbook, are helping faith leaders go watch the election equipment be tested and report out what they're seeing. And so some of the safeguards that we have, there are independent and bipartisan poll workers who run our elections. They're everyday people from our equipment, our communities. Then we have the election equipment that I just talked about. It's tested in public. There are also federal and state laws that require that require certain levels of list maintenance and comparing different lists that the government holds to make sure that the voter rolls are up to date, as well as the maintenance of the voting machines themselves. Some of the potential disruptions, I'm not going to read every one of these and overwhelm you, but we have an elections dashboard on the National Task Force on Election Crises website that goes through and collates different news stories on potential disruptions in the election. And so what you see on the screen is divided, the way that we divide different potential challenges. The one thing that I'll pull out from this is that this issue of claims of non-citizen voting, this is not an issue in our elections. This is something that is played up. There's a lot of false information. There are very few non-citizens on the rolls. It is a crime to vote as a non-citizen. And the number of people who have ever been found to vote who were not citizens is minuscule and has not changed and is very, very, very unlikely to ever change the result of an election. This is a very small number of people. They are often caught and removed from the rolls if they are found. And states generally do a really good job of keeping their lists up to date. So Georgia, just as one example, Georgia checked their entire voter list, and I think they found something of the millions of voters that they have. It was something like 1,000 people for whom they couldn't confirm citizenship. Then they went through that list and tried to find how many had voted. The number was 0. So that's the type of numbers that we're talking about on this. And the worrisome thing here is, from one standpoint, especially as people of faith, we're concerned about the way that this information can lead to violence or lead to mistrust between neighbors. But it's also something that is being weaponized to try to undermine trust in the election, that people might try to use levers later in the election process to overturn the results of the election. So I did want to dig into that for a minute, and I'm happy to answer. I can't see the chat, so I can't see if anyone had questions on that, but I can provide resources on that as well. So the important thing here, one of the most important things in each of these sections, is what can you do? The biggest thing is sharing accurate information about where and how to vote. Encourage people to turn to local officials for information. We are not going to be able to track down and respond to every piece of misinformation. What we can do is educate our communities on where to find accurate information. And the League of Women Voters has really good information, but ultimately going to your election officials themselves is one of the really important things. And then recruiting and serving as poll workers, pushing back on harmful narratives, meeting with election officials, taking part in the observing of testing the election equipment. Those are some other things. I think, Becca, we were going to pause at the end of each section just for any questions that people have, and to break up so you're not just hearing from me for a half hour or whatever it is. So does anyone have any questions?
Feel free to simply come off mute or put them in the chat or raise your hand.
Oops.
I think it's all clear, Chris.
All right. So the next period of time is mail-in voting, and it's pretty self-explanatory, the concept. It's people voting by mail. The rules are different in different states. So in some places, early voting, what we call early voting, is actually mail-in voting, but you can drop off the ballot in person at drop boxes or election centers. Different states have different deadlines. So some states you have to get your ballot in by election day. Some states it has to be postmarked by a certain day. There are lots of safeguards required for ensuring the integrity of mail-in voting. You need proof of identity in order to request a ballot. One of the most important things when we share information is also to empower people to do their own work, trust and verify on our elections process. So you can track your ballot on your state website and see where it is, if it's been processed, if it's been counted. They update the lists. So you hear people wonder, well, what if I mailed in my ballot and then I show up in person? There's a barcode that goes on your ballot envelope that's scanned. And so they know whether or not someone's trying to do that. And if you tried to do that, you would be breaking the law and face a severe penalty. And another note on this is that there's a 90-day quiet period for list maintenance. So also the lists for voting are generally set before we get to this period. When it comes to mail-in voting and some of the developments, one thing that's important to remember on not just this period of time, but throughout our election season, we don't run perfect elections. We never will run perfect elections. This is a human endeavor. There are thousands of jurisdictions across the country. There are going to be mistakes. There are going to be clerical errors. But we have systems in place to account for that. And so there might be delays in the USPS due to bad weather or just regular delays that could happen. There could be mistakes or technical issues where ballots are going to the wrong place. This happens sometimes in small numbers, but there are safeguards for that. And then there's a lot of misinformation that happens during mail-in voting. And so we'll want to push back on that. As far as what you can do, encouraging folks to get mail-in ballots in as soon as possible and to track their ballot is the biggest takeaway, I think, for the mail-in voting period, because you don't know if a weather event is going to happen. You don't know if there's going to be a delay. You don't know if something is going to get in the way of you dropping off the ballot on the day later on that you were planning. So when it comes to early voting and mail-in voting, our guidance is to get in your ballot as soon as you can. I'd also encourage folks to share information about the safeguards that are in place. And then also just trying to speak out against if there is violence and intimidation at drop boxes. Try to speak out against that. Maybe even reach out to law enforcement about ways that you can be helpful or bring issues to their attention if you hear about them. And so I'll pause again there. Any questions on mail-in voting? And I can't see the chat, so if there's someone there, just let me know. If not, we'll just keep rolling.
I think we're all clear.
Right. And then there's early voting and election day. And again, early voting and mail voting, there's some overlap there. During this time, especially early voting, they're setting up the voting machines, helping voters, casting votes. Some of the safeguards that we can recognize. Some states utilize in-person locations. Some do them by mail for early voting. Our elections are staffed by independent poll workers, as well as people from both political parties. They're staffed in a way that people are working together across the aisle. And in some states, they even require it by law that poll workers have to be a certain balance of both political parties. Many aspects of the voting and counting process are open to the public. It varies state by state, but as an example, we went to New Hampshire to observe the New Hampshire primary earlier this year. They're open to the public. Anyone can go and stand within the given area and observe the casting and counting of the votes. Some important things to remember. One thing that became a little bit of an issue in 2020 is that the results are not official when they're called by the networks. They're sort of the media calling the election based on very detailed statistical analysis when enough votes have been cast that they can determine who they think the winner will be. But there's a certification process. And sometimes you'll hear people say, well, who is CNN to say who won the election? They don't have that power. And that's right, they don't, but their projections are correct. But no one is trying to say that CNN has the power to say who won our elections. Some of the potential disruptions and things to be concerned about: intimidation at polling locations, threats against election workers. We've had a lot of turnover in our election administration because there have been so many threats since the 2020 election that a lot of election workers have left the profession and have been replaced. We could see severe weather, as we're seeing right now during early voting. There's also one of the things to really keep in mind is that our elections take a while to count the votes, especially as more people are voting by mail and voting early, and the rules are different in each state as far as how quickly you can process the votes. Many states have made it easier and faster to count the votes this year versus 2020, but Pennsylvania and Wisconsin did not change their law as far as when you can process mail-in votes. And so what ends up happening is they can't start processing mail-in votes until election day. So we probably won't know who won the state of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania until Thursday or Friday at the earliest, with the closeness of the election that we're expecting. Wisconsin could be in a similar situation. Nevada also has some rules that might make it a few more days. And so we really want to encourage people to be patient as the results are coming in. What we can do during this time period, one thing is, I think even with the threats that we face, and I mean, it's my job to point out the potential crises, I still get excited to vote. I still get excited about the election season. And when you go to vote and you see the people working and they're excited, I think we should celebrate voting. We should celebrate exercising our civic duty, and do things like partner with Vote Early Day on October 29th, celebrate Election Hero Day to thank our election workers and highlight that they're everyday people in our communities. We also, through the Faith in Elections playbook, are working with groups that are recruiting poll chaplains and peacekeepers to be a peaceful presence at polling locations. And then from a messaging standpoint, you saw this at the beginning, we should urge calm, patience, and trust in the process. And I think it's incumbent on us, no matter who we're voting for, to call on our candidates to accept the will of the voters. As we'll get into in a minute, there are post-election processes where people can challenge the results in a way that respects the rule of law. We have recounts, we have audits, we have courts, but we should ensure that our candidates are prepared to accept the will of the voters once the final rulings have come from the courts, once all the ballots have been counted. And I think that's especially important to do on our own sides. And I'll pause there and we'll shift after this to the post-election period, but anything on early voting and election day?
Hi, Chris. This is Megan from Interfaith America. Question for you. I heard from a campaign volunteer who was going door to door that it was better. I live in Cincinnati, Ohio, that it was better for me to vote early, that would prevent potential distrust of the results on election day, and was encouraging folks to show up at our Hamilton County Board of Elections and vote early in person. Just curious your take on her suggestion.
I don't know.
Does that really make a difference, I guess, is my question.
I don't know the rules in Ohio. My guess is she said that's related to the speed of counting the votes, because when it takes longer to count the votes, there's more time for people to question. And it's not even just the bad faith things. I think people who are not paying attention to elections at the level that we might be, there was a time when they went to bed on election night, they would know the results, and now they don't. And when they see the results changing due to very normal circumstances, all the votes are being counted, I understand why people might have questions. So my guess is that they can start processing and counting the early votes, and then they'll release them as soon as the polls close. And so that might help with that component. So I think there's something to that. The reasoning that I would say to vote early is more to just make sure that you're able to cast your vote. We don't know what's going to happen in our personal lives. We don't know what's going to happen with the weather. So I encourage people to vote early in person if you can, because that's the best way to ensure that no matter what else happens, your vote is going to be counted and that you're going to be able to get there.
Great, thank
you. Any other questions on election day? All right. And now we get into the time period that used to be boring, but now we're all going to pay attention to in 2024 in a way that I think we might not have in the past, which is when we get to the section on counting, certifying, and then the Electoral College meeting, and then Congress counts the votes. And so we'll start here with basically from election night through to December 11th. This is the time when the votes are being counted. And then each state has different rules on audits, but in every state there are rules about how close a race has to be and what the procedures will be for a recount. And then each state has rules on the audits. So our election results are checked at the precinct level, at the county level, and at the state level before they're certified at the state level. There are lots of checks in place to make sure that equipment worked properly, that the tabulation was accurate. And then we get into the county certification and the state certification. There are lots of safeguards here, but something to note that we've seen come up in some states that's worth noting is that the canvassers and the people who certify the elections, that's not a discretionary role. That's a place in the process that's certifying that the process of the election has been completed and is moving to the next stage. And it can be kind of confusing because they're voting. And so you might think that there's more discretion. But the thing to keep in mind here is that the checks have all happened and the lawsuits generally have been resolved before they get to the certification bodies. So all the different issues have been resolved. The results have been checked. The analogy that some of my colleagues have used is if you're thinking of like a football game, the certifiers are like the scorekeeper. So there are other people in the process of a football game who are actually doing the work and putting points on the board. There are referees who will then say whether something's legitimate. They enforce the rules. Then the scorekeeper at the end of those processes puts the numbers on the board according to the process that led to that. I have found that to be a really helpful metaphor. What has happened in some of the primaries, and there were attempts to do this in 2020, is that people have tried to refuse to certify or have faced pressure not to certify the election. The reason that that's potentially a challenge is that the law that was passed in 2022 to shore up the post-election process also put in hard deadlines for when states have to finalize different processes. And so if elections aren't certified on time, you could bump up against the different deadlines. What's happened so far this year is that when state or county canvassers have voted no, they were very quickly educated on the process and the risks of not fulfilling their duties under the law. And so in one county in Nevada, there was a 3-2 vote not to certify the election, even though the proper process was used. And within days, they reconvened and voted 4-1 in favor of certifying the results. And I know that that can feel kind of wonky, but this is one of the real pain points that we'll have to think about. What can each of us do to help keep the process moving? Some of the potential developments, I think I've spent enough time on the certification piece, but there's also potential for violence, threats to election officials or the people tabulating the votes, also refusal of candidates to accept the results and what might happen as a result. And there's a lot that we can do during this time period. We should consider attending the board meetings or other events to push back on election subversion attempts. We should encourage officials to count every vote, whether we think the votes that are left are from people who voted like us or voted for a different candidate. We want their votes to be counted. There's also, especially for faith communities who we talk to a lot, there's also a determination to be made of whether your organization is in a position where you would want to mobilize, if there's a mobilization effort, or if there are other ways that you want to be involved, and assessing what are the risks to mobilizing. And then again, you see pretty much on every slide now, when we get to what you can do, urge calm and patience and trust in the process, continue to educate your network, and then also provide support for officials who are under pressure to overturn the will of the people. Literal support, political cover by speaking out in favor of them doing their job. I think that this is going to be an area that we haven't really had to focus on as much as we are in this election. So this is going to be new to people. And I think we have to be ready to take the actions to help the process. Any questions? I'm going to keep asking because I have to take a sip of tea. So, and we'll have time at the end for discussion too. So if you think of questions, we can get back to them even if we've moved past the slide. One other thing that happened as a result of the reforms in 2022 is that the Electoral Count Reform Act that was passed in 2022 requires electors to meet on December 17th. And so in each state, that's the day that the electors will meet to technically cast the votes for president. And then the electors their votes are sent to the archivist, which is on Christmas, which I will tell you, you don't have to worry about what happens when they get to the archivist. Those of you who celebrate Christmas don't plan to have to do anything on that day. It's a very technical date. As far as some of the potential challenges during this time, we could see attempts to try to get the states to miss that deadline. One thing is all of these different attempts to subvert the process the end goal is to have confusion when it's time to count the votes in Congress and provide enough cover for people in Congress to try to overturn the results or reject slates of electors like they tried to do during the 2020 election. And so the concern is especially if there are threats to the electors or attempts to not allow them to meet at the given place that they're supposed to by law. This is an effort that could be done to try to provide cover to members of Congress who would want to disrupt the process. So we should all call out attempts to delay the process. We should share facts about the importance of this process. Also consider, again, keeping in mind whether you're in a position to do this sort of mobilization, prepare for the attempts that could happen to disrupt the Electoral College process and be ready to counter them. And as always, there it is again, urge calm, patience, and trust in the process. Then we get to Congress, where Congress has to organize itself and then count the votes. The members of Congress who will meet on January 3rd and be sworn in, this will be a new Congress. So these will be the members who are elected in the November election, will be sworn in on January 3rd. They will then have to pass their rules, elect a speaker, which is not necessarily as easy as it seemed even a couple of years ago. And then they'll convene on January 6th. Their role, by the words in the Constitution, is to count the votes. The reforms from 2022 have clarified further that the vice president's role is ministerial. They can't insert themselves into the process. That reform also required objections to be made by 1/5 of each chamber of Congress. It used to be that just one vote in each chamber would cause the joint session to have to go vote on the objections. And then the ECRA also limits some of the permissible reasons that a member of Congress can invoke for objecting to a state slate of elector. Unfortunately, a lot of us know what the potential disruptions are on January 6th because we saw them on the last January 6th in 2021. And so we should all be thinking about the ways that we can try to ensure a peaceful process. We should share all the steps that we've already talked about to protect the accuracy of the count, educate people about the process. Also, educate and even call on your members of Congress to fulfill their constitutional duty. They're going to be under pressure. My opinion is that no matter who wins, there will be movements in our country to try to get members of Congress to reject slates of electors. And I think we have to take our actions to educate the public and get in touch with our members of Congress to encourage them to fulfill their duty and do their job, because they will be hearing from people who want them to not do that. And there it is again, urge calm and patience and trust in the process.